There's an assassination manual written by the CIA in 1952 about. Really, it's the first one that they put on. They write it out. But the person writing this essay, he was very keen on throwing people off buildings. Sort of, and the assassination manual tells you how essentially 75 feet onto a hard surface seems to be the recommendation.
Simon Ball is Professor of International History and Politics at the University of Leeds. He's the author of 6 acclaimed books, including Secret History, The Bitter Sea, and The Guardsman. And his latest book is Death to Order, A Modern History of Assassination. So, Professor Simon Ball, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
What is the difference between assassination and murder?
I think the working definition is an assassination is political murder, and in the English tradition, it's the targeting of an individual for death by an organized conspiracy for political purposes.
Quite an involved definition then.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain moving part. It's got to be political, it's got to be deliberate, and it's got to be organized. It's not just a random killing.
And tell me, why did you feel a book like this is necessary to write? History of Modern Assassination. What prompted you to do that?
It seemed to me that there is quite a lot of work on assassination and lots of general histories of assassination as well. It's a topic of enduring interest. So there are plenty of singular books about particular assassinations, and there are plenty of archives on them, and people have delved into them, some very famous ones. But it usually ends in disappointment because the answers that people are looking for aren't usually there, or they feel that something isn't there.
Can I ask you about particular assassinations? I mean, if you look through the history of 20th century assassinations, does one particular one stand out as being the one that had the most impact, the most influence on history itself?
Yeah, I think I'll give a two-part answer. Most people agree that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914, just because of the catastrophic effects of the beginning of the First World War, would usually be cited, and I don't disagree with that. I mean, it's hard to think of a more consequential assassination than Franz Ferdinand, and it's the one that begins the book. Because I think that started the modern age of assassination, because policymakers, politicians, civil servants, policemen, secret policemen, they couldn't really ignore it after that. They realized that assassination could have very significant consequences. However, what I noticed is that that some really consequential assassinations tend to be overlooked by anybody who is not a specialist. So in the book, I argue that we could come up with a different list of consequential assassinations, and I'll pick two to give an example. One would be the assassination of Sir Lee Stack in 1924. Not, I think we would agree, necessarily a particularly well-known historical figure. Lee Stack was the commander of the Egyptian army, and he was Governor General of the Sudan, and he was assassinated. And in response to that assassination, the British government decided to sunder the Sudan from Egypt irrevocably. But that was an example of a decision being made after an assassination which has had long-term effects on the people who live there and geopolitically. Another assassination, which isn't much cited, is that in 1928 of someone called the Old Marshal Zhang Zulin, who is the ruler of Manchuria, and he's assassinated by the Japanese army. And that has the consequence, essentially, of destabilizing any hope for democracy in Japan, and also opening the way for the Japanese attempt to take over not only Manchuria, but in the end, China itself, which leads to a massive war and world historic consequences. So just because most people haven't heard of it doesn't mean that it's not consequential.
Does it surprise you, or should it surprise us, that one of the prime movers behind assassinations are governments and states, and not just, as we might think, totalitarian governments, but democratic governments as well have got a hand in this nefarious trade? Is that a problem for us, or is that a legitimate act of state?
I mean, two questions. Should it surprise us? Is it legitimate? I'll take them in order. Surprise here now, I don't think it should surprise us. It's not that democratic states hadn't flirted with assassination before the mid-20th century, but it's really the late 1930s when in various democratic states, Britain would be an example, there is a sense that the state should have a machinery for carrying out assassinations. And you can see the theory of the case. Britain faced by predatory powers, most notably Nazi Germany led by Hitler. Wouldn't it be better if he wasn't there? And so so states start to build assassination mechanisms from the late 1930s. They used them in the Second World War. The thing is, assassination has no real impact on the Second World War, certainly in practical terms.
Do democratic countries engage in assassination just as much as what we would consider totalitarian countries? I mean, is Britain and America equally as culpable in terms of as many assassinations that they authorize and propagate, or is it mostly done by, let's call, darker governments, shall we say, totalitarian types, or is it equally?
Well, the one thing about dark governments is they're not really good at kind of producing robust statistics. So it's quite hard to do that exact combination. But in general terms,
but then we don't produce statistics either of how many people we assassinate, do we?
That's so the Obama administration in America did publish some statistics. Now there is a quirk to that. So in the early 20th century, the United States government got its lawyers to have a look at this question of assassination and whether it is legitimate. Now, there is an assassination ban in the United States. It was introduced in 1976 and it's still in power today. It's an executive order. So it could be revoked. Donald Trump could revoke it tomorrow, but no US president has. So the Americans didn't want to use the word assassination, but they did want to carry out assassinations. And so they got the lawyers onto it, and the lawyers said, well, assassination is a very narrow thing that, sort of, if we kill people for political reasons, but it's in self-defense, then that's okay. That's not an assassination under the US assassination ban. And so, right, go ahead. And it's at this stage that gives the green light for what's already happening, which is the development of new technologies, most famously drones. So President Obama was more open about this. One of the things that he said was that we need to bring this more into the light. We've had kind of quasi denial under George Bush, but he did it and I'm doing it. And if we're going to discuss this with our own citizenry and indeed negotiate with other states, we can't just pretend that we're not doing what everybody knows we're doing. So the Obama administration 2016 did publish some statistics.
Because Obama brought all of this out in the open in a very, very powerfully public way, particularly with the assassination of Osama bin Laden, because I remember
Indeed.
footage of the president watching the screen of the assassination taking place with all his supporters around him, and
exactly
the
that.
assassination going on, and very publicly doing this.
I mean, you can't get much more public than have sort of sending your forces into another sovereign nation, finding your target, getting someone to shoot him, then exfiltrating the body, running DNA tests on it, and then filming the burial at sea. Because quite often in what is now called personality assassination. Remember, most assassinations are people that we haven't heard of, because assassination is usually aimed at people lower down the scale, and is arguably more effective if it is. But these big name assassinations, you actually have to convince everybody they're dead, because there's no point just killing somebody. You have to publicly kill somebody, and that's what President Obama said. And so he was much more open about it than hitherto. So there is a certain amount of openness. I mean, let's face it, not everywhere. It would be hard to get Russian statistics, for instance. And although Britain does carry out targeted killings and has done so, quite recently.
This idea of assassinations being public,
Yeah.
very public. I mean, I think you have to divide your assassinations into the secret, private ones, where you go off and secretly kill someone. And sometimes people don't even know that they've been assassinated or killed because it looked like natural circumstances. Whereas on the other side of the coin, there are the most public assassinations that could be made. I'm thinking particularly of one not so long ago, a Russian, Litvinenko, who was poisoned in London, but done so, it seems to me, in a way which could not have been other than the most public demonstration that this is the state killing somebody. He was killed with this radioactive substance, polonium-210, which cannot be obtained by anybody other than by a state actor, as far as I can see. And agents were sent to poison his tea in the Cafe Royale in Regent Street, and people tracked it around. And he died a horrible death 3 weeks later on in the most public way. I mean, it was as if the public part of it was the crucial part of this particular death or assassination.
That would seem to be the case. I mean, there's kind of Putin isn't the first one in this field. Stalin, kind of was notably. This is particularly targeting opponents of the regime, emigre opponents. The most famous one would be Trotsky in Stalin's case. And so it has both a domestic and an overseas audience, and it's essentially saying dissent will not be tolerated. There will be punishment, and so don't betray the regime. So there is certainly a substrate. Just on your secret assassination thing, it's actually harder to do. There's a very well documented assassination from the 1970s when the Chilean Secret Service assassinates an emigre in the center of Washington, D.C. And General Pinochet had hoped that this could be done as an accident, to look like an accident. But his professional assassin said, there's no way that we can carry this off. There are some examples of it in Serbia. Former president of Serbia at the beginning of the 21st century was assassinated, and then his body was dissolved in acid, and nobody knew he'd been assassinated there. It became apparent when the same group assassinated the Serbian prime minister a few years later, and the investigations of that was a very public assassination. A sniper shot him in the street, and then there was an investigation, and they discovered that nobody had seen the former president for some years because he was dead.
I would have thought it was easier to do secret assassinations because the tools which are available now are far more technological and sophisticated. One imagines, certainly when watches James Bond movies and things like that, that there is a substance you can inject which will induce a heart attack and no one would know that it was done deliberately, or there are microwaves that can be beamed through buildings or such like. And
well, in a Bond movie, but again, it's, if you want to be sure, then a pistol bullet to the head from short range. That's why, although it was an assault rifle in this case, that's why the Americans rejected. They didn't use drones or anything like that, and they didn't use a massive airstrike. Couldn't use a massive airstrike because then they couldn't prove he was dead. They didn't use high tech because you couldn't be sure. They actually got a person next to the target and shot him in the head. And so, sort of relatively low tech, but if you're talking about the high tech options, they're very spectacular because it's not just a missile firing drone. In order to have a missile firing drone, you need thousands of people. You need you need an intelligence system. You need to be geospatially able to identify a target. You need a logistics system. So high-tech assassination tends to be, kind of more public than low-tech assassination. The low-tech end tends to breed the conspiracy theories. There's an assassination manual written by the CIA in 1952 about. Really, it's the first one that they put on. They write it out. But the person writing this essay, he was very keen on throwing people off buildings. Sort of, and the assassination manual tells you how essentially 75 feet onto a hard surface seems to be the recommendation in that manual. And notoriously, there was an assassination in Prague in 1948. It was a defenestration, and a lot of the Russian assassinations or rumored assassinations tend to be defenestrations. But essentially, if you're going to say that every time somebody has an accident that's assassination, that you kind of that you move out of the realm of the provable and thus analyzable into the speculative.
What are the most unusual or bizarre methods of assassination? I mean, one comes to my mind, which I remember hearing about it at the time, and it was Gorky Markov, who was again in London and was injected with a small pellet of ricin in the leg by using a modified umbrella, which sounds very kind of 1950s Secret Service kind of approach?
It wasn't that bizarre in many ways, because essentially the umbrella was a gun mechanism. It was a short range gun. The projectile was unusual, but they were doing really what I just described: get a gun very close. Now there were some twists. The Russians have indeed sort of been keener on poisons and toxins than some other powers, and in the late 1950s, uh, there are a series of assassinations of Ukrainian emigres living in Germany, including the leader of the Ukrainian emigres himself, a man called Stepan Bandera, who is assassinated in Munich. And in that case, the gun sprayed poison. So it was a poison gun. So the assassin sprayed him rather than
Like a water pistol?
yeah, kind of something like that. And that one is very well known because the assassin then defected to the West. And there, in the 1950s, there are a number of Soviet assassins who defect for various reasons. Once, in that case, after they carried out the assassination, but there's another one who defected before, and they bring their weapons with them. And so from the 1950s, you get some great pictures, which are essentially CIA, American propaganda pictures of, sort of Soviet assassination weapons. But that really doesn't take off. If we go to, the ones which kind of people sometimes think about is attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro by
Yeah.
the CIA, and exploding cigars. And yes, those were developed. There were all these kind of kooky ideas. Perhaps it's a very 1950s thing, but the most serious plan for the assassination of Fidel Castro involved a military grade rifle. And the Americans didn't really get close to Castro because their operations were so often penetrated by Cuban intelligence. So quite often the people they thought were assassins were in fact double agents or potential assassins. So if we get hung up on the tech, which people often do with Castro, the problem was the people, not the tech. They couldn't get anybody close enough to Castro who would actually assassinate him, because they were either captured before they got near, or in fact they were working for the Cuban regime, and then it became a kind of sort of a way of revealing the evil and perfidy of the Western imperialists.
Yeah. The Russians seem to have specialized in poisoning assassinations, because there was one which occurred, or tried to be occurred, not too far from where I live, just a few tens of miles up the road, which is the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury.
Yes.
The kind of bottle of some kind of Novichok, whatever,
Yeah.
nerve agent. What did you make of that?
Well, I mean, by the time you get to the Skripal case, there are no archives, so that would be the first thing. So, but it fits in with the Litvinenko element. It's highly public, because if you're going to do it in Britain, you know that there is a highly developed security apparatus which will investigate. And that there, whatever was used, there would be a degree of revelation. And therefore, I think we can assume that revelations are part of the the plan. These assassinations are terroristic in the classic sense. They are designed to cause terror and unease, both amongst potential traitors, amongst emigres, and also in the country which is offering some kind of sanctuary. Not least because it demonstrates the impotence of that country.
It's basically saying that it doesn't matter where you go, and it doesn't matter, who you are. We can get to you, and you can know that it's us because we're using poisons that no one else could get hold of. You
Yeah,
know it's the state that's doing it, and you are completely vulnerable no matter where you are.
we have to remember that most assassinations aren't like that. Most assassinations, and arguably the most effective ones, are aimed at uh, uh, people like intelligence officers or policemen. Um, and if we're talking about mass assassination campaigns, you're both trying to delegitimize and blind the ruling authority. So they're highly practical as well as sometimes symbolic, but sort of they tend to be for practical reasons.
Can we come back to the CIA? I mean, that seems to be having the finger pointed at it quite often in many circumstances as the prime organization that America uses for assassinations. Is that a fair comment about the CIA?
The Americans have two tracks. They have a military organization, and they have a CIA organization, and the two cross over because if there's a CIA-sponsored drone strike, that would actually be done, kind of using the United States Air Force kind of facilities to do that. So so no, they are a strand, and in fact, the CIA historically got quite sniffy about all this because they kept saying you keep talking about the CIA, but this is a whole state effort. So at various stages. For instance, the Kennedy administration wasn't particularly happy with the CIA's efforts on Cuba. And so it took the overall assassination program, famously known as Mongoose, out of the CIA's hands and put it in the hands of the Department of Defense.
Kennedy didn't have much confidence in the CIA, from what I recall. He threatened at one point, quite publicly, to smash up the CIA and splinter it into 1,000 pieces, essentially doing away with it. Is that?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of that really has been a there are kind of serious reports. The CIA was created in 1947, and the first report investigating the CIA to see whether it was up to the job was 1949. So the American presidents and American governments kind of are usually dissatisfied with the CIA. It's a kind of a natural state of affairs, although notably none of them have in the end felt the need to get rid of it. The biggest reform was the creation of what Tulsi Gabbard's job now, which is Director of National Intelligence, which split off part of the DCI functions. But by and large, the CIA doesn't get much reform.
I suppose the most famous assassination of all time, possibly, but certainly the most fascination of the 20th century was Kennedy's assassination. And the number of theories about that, including CIA involvement, have been widespread since 1963. Do you have any comments upon your thoughts of what brought that about and what was behind it?
Uh, since 2000, there has been a congressionally mandated release of any US government document related to the Kennedy assassination. And we're down to about 30, I think, which haven't been, they're still arguing about. So there are hundreds of thousands of pages of government documents on the Kennedy assassination, which tells you a great deal about so many things, but doesn't change one's view of the Kennedy assassination. So Lee Harvey Oswald with a military surplus rifle in Dallas. Kind of that's what it started with, and that's I think where it'll end. However, what it does reveal is the internal dynamics, and this is really kind of what Death to Order is about, the internal dynamics for policymakers. The fear, as soon as Kennedy was killed, was that it was a Soviet assassination. And what the documents reveal is that and this is what they're trying to keep secret, is that the CIA had a very successful operation to bug the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, where Lee Harvey Oswald went and talked to an official, so the Americans could listen to that conversation. And that official was a KGB officer undercover, and he was actually from what's known as Special Tasks Department of the CIA, of the KGB, which is assassination. But what they actually say is they signal, we've got the signal to the station, is thank God you had this bugging operation, because we might have believed it was the Soviets if we hadn't been actually listening to the rather bland conversation about visas, if we didn't have all this information. The Soviets themselves are worried that they're going to be accused and give the Americans documents. They send a representative to Kennedy's funeral, a member of the Presidium, who's very close to Khrushchev, to reassure the Americans it wasn't them. And the Americans, now under Johnson, accept that this was not a Soviet assassination. That is the important story of the Kennedy assassination. That the Americans decided that it was not a Soviet assassination. All the other conspiracy theories, because in 1963, if the Americans had decided that there was a widespread conspiracy, and that this war, that this was a foreign power who had assassinated the commander-in-chief, the president, then the potential consequences for that are intense. There weren't many consequences from the Kennedy assassination. There's a lot of talk about the Kennedy assassination, but what actually happened is the Americans decided that it wasn't the Soviets, and that's the thing they cared about. That's what the Soviets cared about, and they're the two superpowers, nuclear weapons. And President Johnson, the succession works very smoothly, and you get a new president, and everything goes on.
Well, the other side of the coin here is possibly even worse than it being a Soviet assassination, but there's much speculation that actually the CIA was deeply involved with that assassination, and that they were instrumental in bringing it about, maybe on their own or with other agents too, rather than simply being the lone gunman Oswald, who claimed himself that he was a patsy. Or the fall guy for a bigger operation. What's your view of the CIA involvement in that? Is there any, or is it just another of those conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I mean, it's a James Ellroy novel. And can be enjoyed very much. I'm a big fan of James Ellroy, so it can be enjoyed very much on that. However, the CIA do not help themselves, because there is a lot of material, which kind of gives conspiracy theorists fuel. So, for instance, and again, this actually comes through both in the investigations of the CIA itself, which have now been released in the archives, but also, and they're in the Kennedy archive, in the National Archives, which is all online very helpfully, is in the early 1960s, just before the Kennedy administration, the CIA was trying to think about how to kill Castro. They definitely wanted to assassinate Castro. And they came up with the bright idea of getting the mafia to do it. So there was a kind of, and the documents now show absolutely that they were, the CIA kind of were collaborating with the mafia, and indeed this came back to bite them, because then the mafioso who they were hoping would organize the assassination was then being deported in the late 1960s and saying, wait a minute, I work for the American state. And so, kind of just before the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, this hit the news again. So CIA in cahoots with the mafia, yes, absolutely. To assassinate Kennedy, no. Those are the but there's plenty of nefarious stuff to be going on with, and that's what I mean about letting the archives, kind of investigating the archives. If you say I must investigate the Kennedy assassination, that gives a very tunnel vision. Whereas you say, I'm interested in assassination, you think, wait a minute, these Kennedy documents, they're great. They're telling us about all kinds of assassinations in the CIA. Just they didn't assassinate Kennedy.
The whole idea of conspiracy theory, I understand, of the very term conspiracy theory, came from, I understand, the Kennedy assassination. The idea that there's just one lone person out there, Oswald, who decided he would shoot the president, was then counterbalanced by people who said, well, no, there has to be more than one shooter. And that was labeled as a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And there was a fantastic job done in terms of making that term a term of contempt, a term of ridicule, that if something was a conspiracy theory, it was automatically wrong and to be dismissed. Does the media play much of a role in this kind of a approach to assassination, in changing the language for us?
So nobody doubts the that assassinations are conspiracies, secretive, illicit, illegal. Certainly in some jurisdiction, even that it's going to be illegal. So it's the theory bit, which sort of is this untethered to any truth. And in the Kennedy case, the Americans reinvestigate their congressional investigations in the 1970s, and they are the most expensive congressional inquiries of the 20th century into the assassinations of Martin Luther King and John Kennedy. And they do indeed. So, kind of part of the American state, the legislature, kind of spends an enormous amount of time, money, and effort investigating this. And they do come to the conclusion, and this is still, kind of the conclusion, that they are conspiracies. But the conspiracy is that the shooters in both cases didn't act entirely alone, i.e., they had some support from family and friends who hid them. It is clear in the Martin Luther King case, where the assassin of Martin Luther King actually gets out of America. He is arrested at Heathrow Airport. So there was, he did have a network of contacts to get him out after shooting Martin Luther King. So, sort of, kind of assassination is almost inevitably a conspiracy, but you have to get the right conspiracy. And all conspiracy theory means is you've got the wrong conspiracy.
There's the other Kennedy brother was also assassinated tragically, Robert Kennedy,
Mm.
under again same strange or questionable circumstances, insofar as there was one guy who was identified as the murderer, but reports that there were more shots than could have been
Yeah,
fired by just
yeah.
it,
I mean, kind of once we get into that kind of stuff, then I don't really think, kind of, yeah, kind of, we're not going to get very far. Interestingly, the uh, the PLO, or the Black September terrorist organization of CI uh, of the PLO in the 1970s, did try and claim the Kennedy administration because the shooter was a man of Middle Eastern descent. And they said, yeah, kind of, it was, kind of, kind of Middle Eastern terrorist conspiracy, against the man, kind of the Western imperialists, but kind of, they didn't believe it, and Richard Nixon, just laughed and said, whatever, kind of, yeah, that's fine.
no.
The problem was that they had assassinated the American ambassador in Sudan, Cleo Noel. So again, kind of this tendency to just to get fixated on personality assassinations means that people are diverted away from very real assassinations which are taking place, which there Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger have to deal with in 1973. So kind of, the Kennedy is ancient history by that stage.
Yeah. I mean, many of the assassinations which we've discussed and talked about seem to have a whole range of unintended consequences, from the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, where you didn't expect a First World War to come about from it, the assassination of Gandhi, which produced an even more powerful figure than the one which he was when he was alive. Um, is assassination always counterproductive?
Kind of, again, in any historical investigation, finding or speculating about counterfactuals isn't very helpful. Um, uh, you know, for instance, you could argue that the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, uh, kind of, who's the deputy head of the SS, architect of the Holocaust,
Yeah.
he, is in 1942. He's assassinated by the British and the Czechs. Kind of justified assassination. Kind of, sort of had all kinds of important, consequences, showing that the Nazi elite are not invulnerable. However, kind of, it led to the wiping out the Czech resistance, which was the actual, practical outcome of it. So, kind of, at best, you're dealing with ambiguity when you start speculating. I just think it's easier and more productive to look at what actually happened as a result of assassination, not go too far down the what if route.
Okay. As we're approaching the end here of our talk, can I just move you on to ethics, which may be a thorny and difficult issue, but can assassination ever be fully or properly justified within, say, a Western democratic country? Is there not an argument that assassination should never be countenanced because we believe in due process of law? If someone wants to be taken out of the way, then bring them before a court and try them and find them guilty, and not just do that before they've had a chance to defend themselves.
Yeah, and indeed that is the argument that the American state in particular has made. So the CIA assassination manual of 19, 52 does actually talk about the ethics of assassination, and just says, it's very hard to justify this ethically. So anybody who's going to get involved in this, needs to know that they won't be behaving ethically. And indeed, in 1976, the American state said and still says that assassinations are, kind of not ethical, and that no official of the Republic should be involved in them. I said what they did is they just redefined assassination and called it targeted killing. My favourite thought on this, it wasn't directly addressing assassination, is J.R.R. Tolkien, who who said, many as die deserve to live. Can you give them life? Obviously not. So don't be quite so quick
I
to
remember
wish
that
death
quote
on people.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a very powerful. I mean, it's in a very popular work of fiction, but as you know, kind of
It's an
Tolkien was a,
argument against the death penalty as a whole, though. That
yeah,
was...
yeah, exactly that. It's easier to kill people than to do something opposite. So I think, kind of, yeah, that would be my Tolkien-esque take on it.
My last question to you, Professor Ball, and that is, what is happening today? You know, 2025. Are assassinations still going on? Are they frequent or are they rare? Are multiple assassinations taking place behind the scenes that we know nothing about, and they're happening in their hundreds, say? Or are they a rare event or hardly ever happening at all today? What's the situation here and now?
Yeah, they happen virtually every day, and
Virtually every day.
and we're not talking about secret. Sort of. I finished the book in December 2024. Sort of. So 110 years it covers, and that seemed enough. But I do keep a list of the news feeds of kind of assassinations, kind of as they or targeted killings, if you prefer, as they pop up into the news. I mean, they don't get much coverage, but there's sort of, so, but my kind of my little archive grows almost day by day of somewhere someone in the world is assassinated.
Well, Simon Ball, thank you very much indeed for your time and for an interesting discussion about a darker world. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I can recommend the book Death to Order, A Modern History of Assassination, very thoroughly researched and full of many examples of the kinds of things that we've been talking about today. Published by Yale University Press, by the look of it, so easily available. Thank you very much.